take you to Canberra now. The Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg has been talking to the media about this energy plan.
Good afternoon. Today, Jay Weatherill made a $550 million admission of failure. Going it alone created South Australia's problems, and going it alone won't fix South Australia's problems. In fact, the measures announced today will only increase electricity prices for South Australians and has the potential to increase prices for Victorians, for people in New South Wales and in Tasmania. Today's announcement by the South Australian Labor government is a warning sign to other states. These 50% renewable energy targets will get you into trouble. There was an insufficient planning and the provision of the necessary skills and systems in place in South Australia to deal with the high uptake of intermittent sources of generation, namely wind and solar. We established some 20 years ago a national electricity market in order to ensure that the lowest cost electricity was dispatched in 5-minute intervals. Today, South Australia wants to rip up that national agreement, and in doing so will only drive up prices for its people as well as those in other states.
You say this is going to push power prices up in South Australia. Jay Weatherill says this is going to put power prices down. You can't both be right. What's your evidence for saying it'll push prices up?
Well, firstly, James, his track record is pretty poor indeed. He was saying just weeks ago that his energy system was good for jobs, good for business, good for the people of South Australia, and saying that there was nothing to see here. It was all okay. Today, he has admitted failure. But by mandating that certain amounts of power is required to come from generation within South Australia will drive up prices because it goes against the model that was set up by all the states with the national electricity market. And in terms of other states, it's pointed out in their document today that they want the South Australian minister to have the power to direct AEMO to change the volumes on the interconnector. So take a situation, for example, where they want to increase the supply into South Australia of power coming from Victoria. That will change the supply-demand balance in Victoria and will drive up prices and also threaten energy security in that state. That's the problem with today's announcement.
Is there anything wrong with putting public money into a gas-fired power station since lack of generation is a clear problem?
Well, it's very ironic that today the South Australian government wants to own a power station and a gas-fired power station when it was its own policies, namely the high uptake of these intermittent sources of power, which led to the closure of the northern power station and the mothballing of Pelican Point. And so now Labor is trying to fix its own mess. It's confusing and it's nonsense.
What should he have announced?
Well, we've got the Finkel review, which will be very important in putting in place important measures to secure our energy system. And obviously South Australia has proven, with the number of blackouts that it has had, to be the most vulnerable in the national electricity market. We have, as a federal government, already worked with the Australian Energy Market Operator to ensure that 2 thermal gas-fired power stations are generating in South Australia at any one time. Previously, it was just 1 thermal generator. We've also moderated some of the movements across the interconnectors, and importantly, we have worked to get the settings on the wind farms to ensure that they can ride through these voltage disturbances, which in part led to what happened back in September of last year. The South Australian government created its mess because it didn't plan for it. Now it's trying to fix it, but my message today is going alone created the problem and going alone won't solve the problem.
So you've been crucifying this government for its over-reliance on renewables. It now announces new thermal power. Shouldn't it get a tick, some applause from you?
Well, the point is its own policies had led to the mothballing of thermal generation in the first place. Our message, and the Prime Minister's clear message, is that we need to be technology neutral when it comes to providing energy security, energy affordability as we transition to a lower emissions future. We have a 23.5% RET at the federal level. In South Australia, they have a 50% renewable energy target, and they have the highest penetration of wind and solar on a per capita basis anywhere in the world.
They're putting their money where their mouth is now and they're doing something about it. Doesn't that get any credit from your government?
Well, not the idea that they can take these unilateral actions and threaten the national electricity market, which is all premised on the basis that we would have equivalent burden sharing, that we'll be working together, and that the expertise from the market operator, with its own control room, with its own modelling, with its own people, would be helping to direct the traffic around the national electricity market.
Minister, South Australia doing that. Can you stop them dictating to local firms in terms of how much energy they supply to the state-based market rather than the national market? Can you stop it?
Well, as you know, there are emergency powers that each of the states in the NEM currently have. So they can declare a state of emergency and then make decisions to direct within their own jurisdiction. What South Australia today is saying is that they're not going to meet that threshold. They're talking about a much lower threshold to intervene. Arguably, that may be in contravention with the national electricity market rules, and therefore that is something that we'll take advice on.
Are you seeking legal advice on that?
We are seeking advice on whether the decision today by South Australia to go it alone is in breach of the national electricity market rules, which obviously has kept the system together for the last 20 years.
Now, if South Australia dropped the 50% RET today, do you believe there would be private investment in coal or gas-fired power?
Well, the key for South Australia, as the Prime Minister has made clear with our recent announcement about a pumped hydro feasibility study for Kultana in the Upper Spencer Gulf, is that we need more storage into the system. So that's got to be a real priority, and you know the Commonwealth always stands ready.
Gas and coal-fired power.
And in relation to gas, gas is critical as a transition fuel.
Is anyone going to invest in it? If they drop the 50% RET, as you say they should, who's going to invest in it, if not the state government?
Well, obviously companies will invest if there is money to be made, and there is our view that if we can get the gas to be available nationally, and that also includes in South Australia, then companies will invest in gas-fired generation. The problem has been, David, the price of gas. It has gone up in large amounts in recent times as the market gets tight.
Are you going to do something about that tomorrow?
Well, tomorrow is going to be a very important meeting because we are now exporting 2/3 of what we produce. Companies are saying to us how difficult it is to get gas contracts. We're seeing in situations, for example, in Victoria and indeed South Australia, where gas which was meant for the domestic market has been now exported to Queensland and off to Asia. So we will be having a very frank conversation with the energy companies tomorrow, and led by the Prime Minister.
You and your colleagues are also looking at whether the federal government should invest in a coal-fired power station, aren't you? So there's nothing all that unusual about taxpayer-funded thermal power generation.
Well, here we're hearing about the state wanting to own and build its own.
You wouldn't do that.
Well, we've not been talking about building and owning a new power station. What has been talked about was the provision of low interest loans, which would be in cooperation with an investor. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? The problem is that we've seen higher levels of intermittent sources of generation come into the grid without the necessary backup. And when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, the system can become unstable at times of peak demand. And whether it's more battery storage or whether it's hydropower, gas or coal, that can be provided on a base load basis. And that's what South Australia needs. That's what we need across the system to ensure that the transition is smooth.
Is the state government's announcement that they will put money into storage?
Well, storage is a good thing. If they can invest some more money into storage, we would welcome that. And as you know, the Commonwealth is leading that effort. We have announced studies for a pumped hydro facility at Kidston in Queensland, and as I mentioned, the one in the Upper Spencer Gulf. And as the Prime Minister has made clear, we've got 3 pumped hydro facilities currently in Australia. One is at the Snowy, and another is in the Wivenhoe in Queensland, and another is at Shoalhaven in Sydney. 3 facilities without one being built in the last 30 years. Now, 97% of storage when it comes to renewables is pumped hydro. So if we can find the right facilities and the right locations, and we've got the ANU providing us a map of various places for pumped hydro facilities, then that will be important for the system as a whole. That's why we're leading the charge through ARENA, through the CFC, but if more can be done by the South Australian Government or indeed any other governments on storage, we welcome it.
Isn't the reality also...
Jay Weatherall says the failure has been the lack of national leadership and not sending the right investment signals or not sending firm enough policy signals to encourage investment. And he also says that South Australia has lost faith in AEMO after its actions during the recent blackouts. Can you have done more to have assuaged some of those concerns?
Well, it's funny. Jay Weatherall and his Labor colleagues, indeed at the federal level as well, Bill Shorten, one day they're blaming the weather, the next minute they're blaming the privatisation in South Australia, the next minute they're blaming AEMO, and indeed they're often blaming the federal government. They should take some of the blame themselves. No one told the South Australian government to take more than 40% of their power from intermittent sources without the necessary planning and backup. That's the key. So that's my message to them.
Minister, just one quick one on a separate issue. There's some suggestion that the government is grappling with the idea of perhaps taxpayer funding a campaign to explain the Independent Fair Work Commission's decision on penalty rates. Can you confirm or deny that that is being...
Okay, and that's where we'll leave the Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg there. The main message saying the South Australian Government, of course, has decided to go it alone. This announcement this morning by Jay Weatherall, Josh Frydenberg, they are saying that South Australia created the problem by going alone and will not solve the problem by going it alone.